Our guests today are going to talk to us. Well, you can see the title up here. So this is Gabe Christy, who is a historian, who's worked as a historical carpenter, and who is currently um, curator for a Coast Guard museum, and is also been done historical work for the SEIU Union. And his sidekick is Sam James, who is a Philly musician, um, and does that sort of write songs and cover songs of various stripes of Americana and labor, and also is obviously the sound guy. So
I play the banjo. That's my biography. Gabe does all the heavy work, but my name is Sam James. This is Gabe Christy. Our podcast is Labor Jawn. We cover the working class history of Philadelphia and the surrounding world. And on a personal note, I'm probably the least formally educated person in this room, but when I did go to college, philosophy was my favorite class. So good for that. Good for you guys. But I'm going to lead you over to Gabe Christy to talk about the brotherly love and radical thought.
And I also just need to clarify, Sam also edits every single episode, has been spending like untold hours of his life keeping all of this up online and keeping it all going. But uh, I think we're getting audio through the room.
Yeah, I can change that.
So, welcome. I should also clarify, in both of our biographies, you heard at no point any mention of either of us having any background in philosophy. So bear that in mind. Uh, I am a labor historian. That being said, within labor history and history writ large, basically every other field gets woven in at some point. So in this presentation, I will I'll focus on some of the philosophical underpinnings that show up within early Philly labor history. And next slide, please. So before we begin, we should get a grounding of where we are. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on Philadelphia, but because Philadelphia is a made-up social construct, really, that plot of land was originally inhabited by the Lenin Lenape. And in early 17th century, there was colonization from Dutch, Swedes, some limited English colonization, and then in 1682, William Penn, the kind of we described him as William Penn Sr.'s fail son, but he was the
He failed upward.
yeah, he definitely did. He was the radical Quaker son of Admiral William Penn, who served the English crown rather loyally, was owed a very large sum of money, and instead of getting money, was given the province of Pennsylvania. So in 1683, Penn came over and founded the city of Philadelphia. His theory behind Philadelphia was a kind of modern, enlightened city with broad, open avenues. Every single city block was essentially intended to be a single plot of land with one estate on it. Initially, he didn't want anything to be subdivided. His kind of theory behind everything was that sin and crime comes out of alleys. Basically, the idea was if you look at a city like London and a lot of the like tight-knit European cities with all of their dark alleys and everything, that provides more of an opportunity for crime to happen. So if you have broad open streets with big estates on everything, then you won't have that issue. Now, the problem with all of this was Penn had this idea, founded the city, and then left, and didn't really establish anything to prevent any subdividing from happening. So pretty much immediately, people started selling sections of the plots of land that they had initially bought from him. And then you also started to see more of a merchant and early industrial formation develop. So initially, Penn's idea was that everyone living in Pennsylvania would be more of a gentleman farmer. You might have some wealthy trades or some more of a wealthy artisan. But as everything got subdivided, you started to see uh, more of an early artisanal production system develop. So you had workshops come in with masters and their journeymen and apprentices. And then, as part of that system, you also had indentured workers coming over who would trade usually 2 to 7 years of their life for passage across the ocean so that they could come live in the New World. And then once they were here, they were legally bound to work for the master that purchased their indenture. A lot of the times with that, you uh, you would effectively sell yourself to be indentured, sail over, and once you got here, someone would come and purchase your indenture from the merchant that sent you over.
It's a great system.
Yeah,
It's great.
so you didn't necessarily know who you were going to be coming over to work for. You were just getting over or getting across the ocean. Then, uh, with that, in the even worse system of labor that was developing, was the development of the Atlantic slave trade. And prior to the 17, or prior really to the final end of slavery in Pennsylvania in the 1820s, but we'll get into that in a little bit. The uh, Pennsylvania was never a majority slaveholding province, but it did have a lot of connections to the slave trade. A lot of the wealthier states in Pennsylvania did hold slaves. They were primarily in domestic service or working within, again, that kind of early industrial or early production system. So you'd have them working in some of the merchant houses or warehouses, actually working in skilled trades in the city, um, and then also working in or as servants in the estates of all of the wealthy merchants that were popping up. Um, and then uh, really, Philadelphia specifically began to develop as what was called the London of the New World. It became a major hub for um, early, uh, really mercantilism, some forms of early capitalism, but you had a really strong trade hub because you had both protection from the seas, so you had an enclosed port, because we have that nice sandbar called New Jersey that keeps hurricanes off of our shores for the most part. Um, then, but you still had sea access, usually 3/4 of the year, except for when it would freeze. And then Penn's Quaker philosophy of building or not imposing any religious rules on the subjects also allowed a really wide variety of peoples from across Europe to come over. So that created a kind of early multicultural society in Philly and in Pennsylvania writ large, which then also allowed people to bring all of their trade connections. So you didn't have just connections to, say, trade in England, but you would have English trade, French trade, Dutch trade, German trade. And that also allowed Philly to really become a center for commerce. And then the darker side of that was also a very strong connection to all of the sugar and slave islands in the Caribbean, where Pennsylvania was exporting a lot of goods to. So eh, even if people in Pennsylvania weren't directly participating in the slave trade, a lot of the economy was still built upon that. But now, next slide, please. We're going to touch on something that you should be relatively familiar with, because we were told that you, at least theoretically, read the petition. But we'll get into really the first example of a universal call for human rights in North America. And that's the 1688 Germantown Petition against slavery. So the after Penn founded the city, there was a call to Quakers and kind of Quaker-aligned peoples all around Europe to come and engage in this holy experiment that Penn had set up. Prior to the 1680s, a lot of English Quakers had actually been effectively proselytizing across the German Rhineland and had converted some of the Mennonites and radical Lutherans to Quakerism. Because what keeps on happening with a lot of different Christian sects is everyone comes to the conclusion that you should live a Christ-like life and treat everyone equally and fairly, but everyone comes to that conclusion separately. And Penn and a lot of other Quaker leaders went out and said, hey, we all kind of believe the same thing. We should all do this work together and come join the holy experiment. So there was a group of German Mennonites, Quaker converts, and radical Lutherans that all decided that they wanted to set up a distinctly German community within Pennsylvania. And prior to that, the way every sale of land had happened was you'd basically go to Penn, or go to Penn's land agent more accurately, and you would purchase your own personal estate. They had never sold a grouping of estates before. But these, I believe, 13 families that made up the Frankfurt Company decided that they wanted to establish their own little German enclave within Pennsylvania. And they called it Germantown because it was very inventive. Now, the kind of unique thing about these Germans coming over is that unlike the English, Dutch, and French settlers that were coming over, Germany didn't have overseas colony. Well, Germany didn't exist at the time. It was the Holy Roman Empire. But the German-speaking peoples didn't have any overseas territories and didn't really have any connection to the slave trade. So slavery as a concept just didn't really exist to them. And their first introductions to it were actually while they were in the Netherlands and just heard about it. And they were initially aghast, and then were convinced that there was no way that slavery could possibly exist in Penn's holy experiment, until they, I think shortly before they left, but after they had already purchased the land, they found out that there was in fact slavery in Pennsylvania, and they were already upset about that. So they came over to the New World and had their first actual face-to-face experience with what enslavement was. Obviously, they weren't enslaved themselves, but they saw the treatment and were understandably aghast by that. And then, because they had set aside Germantown as this specific enclave for themselves, they existed separately from the rest of Pennsylvania society. So they were still, a lot of them still spoke German to each other. There were some that didn't, or that never learned English, so they didn't even communicate with any of the other communities in the Philadelphia area. And so because of that, they never really grew accustomed or assimilated to accepting slavery as an institution. And so they continued to kind of softly pressure all of their Quaker brethren to abandon slavery, and kind of called it out as the moral outrage that it was. And eventually that culminated in 1688, when Frederick Daniel Pistorius and I believe 3 other signatories drafted the area petition against slavery, which they then presented to the meeting at Dublin, which is now Ardsley. And the petition basically laid out that not only was owning slaves bad for the Quaker community, but also that slaves or enslaved people were in fact humans, did in fact deserve human rights, and that they basically established a Declaration of Universal Human Rights for really the first time in North America. And just to quote the petition, because talking about it never really gives that as much impact as their original writing. So, speaking of, so to provide some context, so I don't read the entire petition to you, they're speaking of enslaved people. So now though they are black, we cannot conceive there is more liberty to have them as slaves as it is to have other white ones. There is a saying that we shall do to all men like as we will be done ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are. And those who steal or rob men, and those who buy or purchase them, are they not alike? Here is liberty of conscience, which is right and reasonable. Here ought to be likewise liberty of the body, except of evildoers, which is another case. But to bring men hither, or to rob and sell them against their will, we stand against it. In Europe there are many oppressed for conscience sake, and here there are those oppressed which are of a black color. And also with that, really trying to tie back the oppression of enslaved Africans in the New World to the treatment that all of the various minority religions in Europe had been receiving, because the Quakers had fled both English and Dutch persecution. And there were also, the Mennonites had as well, the Huguenots, basically every minority religion in Europe at some point fled. Now, they presented this petition to the Ardsley meeting, which then decided that they didn't have the authority to weigh in on the issue because it would have lasting implications for all Quakers. At the time, about 7% of Quakers in Pennsylvania were slaveholders. But like I said, basically their entire economy was built around or was connected to the slave trade on some level. So the local meeting said, hey, if we rule on this, it's going to have implications way beyond our meeting. We need to raise it up to the quarterly meeting, which was the next level up in Quaker hierarchy. So they sent it to the quarterly meeting, and the quarterly meeting decided that they didn't have the authority to weigh in on it because it was going to have an impact beyond their membership. So it moved up to the yearly meeting, and the yearly meeting recognized, okay, this is a very important topic. We recognize it needs to be discussed. However, if we discuss it here, this is going to have implications for Quakers in England as well. So we need to move it up to the London meeting, which was the kind of that was the top of the hierarchy. So we have records from the yearly meeting that they agreed to send it to the London meeting. We have no records of the London meeting ever receiving it or them ever actually sending it. So from what we can tell and from my understanding of the history, it seems like the yearly meeting probably just kind of brushed this under the rug and let it be. Yeah, that when there's a lot of very good philosophical underpinnings that then come into conflict with your wallet, and usually the wallet wins out. And that happened a lot. So the petition ultimately didn't go anywhere, but it did get rediscovered in, I believe, the 1840s in the Germantown or in the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, and then that became a kind of rallying point for the Quaker abolitionist movement, Because in the interim there, one, slavery was banned for any member of the Meeting of Friends in 1776. Was technically, well, manumission was passed in Pennsylvania in 1780, and then the which basically meant that you couldn't sell anyone into slavery, but if you were currently enslaved in 1780, you were enslaved until your death. So a very half-measure way to get rid of it, but it was at least better than most of the other states at the time. Uh, the uh, but the abolitionist movement among Quakers in Pennsylvania had really become a cornerstone of Quaker community. So finding this document tying their movement back to basically the very founding of Quakers in Pennsylvania really became a rallying cry for them. It then got lost again, and then was rediscovered in the 2010s, I believe in 2013, at the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, and has since been preserved and has been studied.
So it gets lost again, it shows up again in 20 years?
Yeah, probably. I mean, this 2 sheets of paper have really had a heck of a life. But that was the Germantown Petition against slavery. And now we're going to jump ahead almost 100 years to the 1790. I realized that should be 1779. So that's a typo on my part, my mistake. So the 1779 siege of Fort Wilson. So like we had discussed, while Penn had tried to create a Quaker egalitarian society, it didn't work out quite as well as he had hoped, and everything had been proven to be more profitable to subdivide the city and set up little workshops everywhere. And that led Philly to become an economic powerhouse. That also meant that a new class started to emerge in the city, and they really ended up dominating politics. And these were the wealthy merchants. So while most of the wealthy families that came over initially had made their wealth through land holdings in England, basically you had a lot of new money coming up in just buying and selling goods because Philly was a major trade hub. And they were able to solidify power both through gaining or being elected into the legislature prior to 1776, which we'll get into in a second. Pennsylvania had a property requirement for voting, so only landholders had the vote, and this also secluded it to just landholding white men. Yeah, the usual. So they both controlled the legislature, and then from a more interpersonal method, they had control of the welfare in the city. So there wasn't any state-funded welfare programs. There were a lot of almshouse, or there was a city-funded almshouse, but it was basically privately, or a city-run almshouse that was privately funded, and you had to get approval from basically the board of directors of the almshouse, and that was both for the Quaker almshouses, the city almshouse, and any of the other, because I believe there was an Anglican one as well, and that meant that in order to get approval to collect alms, which meant food, firewood, or clothing, especially in the winter months when you were out of work, because one side effect of a lot of Philadelphia being focused on shipbuilding and construction is that there's no work when it's too cold to do either of those jobs. So if that's your trade, you have to go and basically go to an almshouse to get food, or to get wood for cooking, food for cooking, and clothes so that you don't freeze to death.
We're driving Uber.
Or yeah. there is at least one story of a husband and wife team that were scamming the almshouses by they would show up every morning, or they would show up naked every morning, get a full set of clothes, go to a pawnbroker, sell all of their clothes, go spend that money on alcohol, and then show up at the almshouse the next day. And it took them, I think, 3 or 4 tries for them to be caught on that little run. But then, yeah, reading the old court records from 18th century Philadelphia always brings up some very interesting stories. But this basically meant that if you were a working class person walking around Philadelphia and you saw and basically anyone wealthy, you had to show them deference, because at some point that person could be in control of whether or not you ate for 3 months out of the year. This was everything from like giving them a bow to greet them, getting out of their way on the street, just the if you imagine like the peasant level of deference that you'd expect in like a medieval kingdom, this basically got replicated in Philadelphia. So that was the situation in Philly right up until 1776, when, under pressure from the Continental Congress, because also I should point out there was a revolution kind of going on a little bit at the time.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
No ramifications.
No. And so the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, and the legislature from Pennsylvania was very resistant to actually engage in any kind of military action against the British Crown. This is both because they had strong economic ties to England, little bit because of Quaker pacifism, but mostly it was they didn't want to threaten their economy. So they started to be pressured by the rest of the Continental Congress to, one, get more militant. As part of that, they were also getting pressured from below, because writers like Thomas Paine, who wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, had been pushing to create a unicameral legislature, so one single body that would be elected yearly, and basically to establish universal male suffrage. So every male citizen would get the right to vote. And people read that and said, hey, that seems like a really good idea. We should do that. And then they started to get even more upset with the wealthy ruling class that was really controlling the legislature at the time. So 1776, Pennsylvania passes a new constitution. This abolishes the property requirement to vote. So now basically every adult white man has the right to vote, which really could have massive ramifications across Pennsylvania society. Now, there's also still a war going on, so the working class doesn't really ever take the opportunity to solidify their political power. Also, the next year in 1777, the city gets occupied by the British Army. So everyone is like thrown into the opportunity to have this political enlightenment, and then the British come in and you're living under martial law for a year. But while that's going on, all of those working class people are paying very, very close attention to what the wealthy are doing and whether or not they're collaborating with the British. I should also note that right after the Constitution was passed, Pennsylvania politics split between Republicans who wanted to establish, or who wanted to go back to their old style of a Roman-style republic with only landed gentry being able to vote, and constitutionalists who supported the new Constitution. There were some like wealthy merchants and wealthier artisans that fell on the constitutionalist side, but largely, if you were a wealthy merchant, you were on the Republican side. So During the British occupation, all of the working classes were paying very, very close attention to what all of the wealthy were doing with the British there, whether or not they were collaborating with them. And then when the British left, they started to pay very close attention to prices, because in 1778, they started to see massive inflation to the point where people just could not afford literally, yeah, they couldn't afford eggs. You'd be lucky if you could afford eggs. You couldn't afford bread. Really, there was a crisis in getting both bread and wood. So you needed firewood to fuel your stove. You needed bread to have some level of caloric intake. And so they started both complaining through public demonstrations. There were pamphlets published in a lot of the newspapers. And then on May of 1779, a circular, so basically just a broadsheet, appeared around or in the city, which read, "You that have money and you that have none, down with your prices or down with yourselves. For by the living and eternal God, we will bring every article down to what was last Christmas, or we will down with those who opposed." So basically, they're saying we're going to roll back prices, or we're going to overthrow you. And now the other point that I haven't brought up yet is that Philadelphia had its own militia that was raised for the city's defense during the Revolution. And unlike most of the other cities, the militia in Philadelphia was fairly democratically run. They had their own little council. Each unit basically had its own council. It was also separated out, so most of the working class people were in the infantry and the artillery, and then all of the wealthier artisans or any wealthy members of the militia ended up in the city cavalry, because that was a way for you to both show off your wealth. You got a fancy uniform, and you were a little bit less likely to die a horrendous death on an 18th century battlefield because you had a horse and some armor. But what that meant was the city's militia became a really like fomenting ground for all of this anti-monopolist thought. So if you're putting all of the pieces together, you have a large group of very angry working class people who have been trained in military tactics for the past 2 years, and all of whom have access to guns. This is not a good situation if you're a member of the wealthy ruling class. So uh, the city's militia basically started in May, started rounding people up. And if they knew you to be a monopolizer or a price gouger, they would drag you out of your shop or your house, parade you through the street, and publicly shame you for it. They would also threw a lot of them in prison, usually only for a couple of days, but it was a big like public demonstration of strength and saying, hey, we're serious about this, lower the damn prices or this is going to really happen. So the legislature responds. They establish a price fixing committee, which was supposed to roll back prices to what they were in January of 1779. First committee didn't work. Second committee was established in August. That again didn't work because basically they were never willing to actually enforce any of the rules. They said like, hey, we're going to gradually roll back these prices, but we never want to actually give ourselves the enforcement arm to do that, because even though you had access to the vote as a working class person, most of the people in the legislature were still from the wealthier landowning class, because they were the ones who had the free time to run for office because they didn't have to work every day. Yeah. So on August 29th, another broadside showed up in the city. And that read, "The time has now arrived to prove whether the suffering friends of our country are to be enslaved, ruined, and starved by a few overbearing merchants, a swarm of monopolizers and speculators, an infernal gang of Tories, etc., etc." It did actually say etc., etc. in the broadsheet. I'm not just skipping that. Uh, but I call upon you all, in the name of our bleeding country, to rouse up as a lion out of his den, and make those beasts of prey to humble and prove by this day's conduct, then any person whatever, though puffed like a toad with a sense of his own consequences, shall dare to violate the least resolve of our committee. It were better for him that a millstone was fastened to his neck, and he cast into the depth of the sea, or that he had never been born. Rouse, 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 and come on warmly. Which basically meant, like, come ready to fight. The first broadsheet had been signed "Come on coolly," which was more of like, this is a warning. Now they're saying it's about to get very real. So the committee convened in September, or the Legislative Committee on Price Gouging, or on Price Fixing, convened in September. But by the 25th of September, they effectively gave up. They were facing stiff opposition from all of the merchants, and were basically told that they can't do anything. So on the 29th, the militia started organizing. They sent a letter to Charles Wilson Peel, who was one of their radicals and an officer in the militia. And yes, and was also known to be very sympathetic to the workers. So he asked them to come to their meeting on October 4th. Peel, there were three other officers they asked to come. One of them was sick. Peel and two others showed up, and basically got there, realized, oh God, this is actually going to happen, and tried to calm everyone down. That didn't work. So Peel left, went to warn everyone else in the legislature and all of the other officers of the militia that, like, hey, this is about to happen. And after Peel left, a group of militiamen left the meeting and found 4 known price gougers in the city, immediately arrested them, paraded them through the city as criminals, playing the Rogues' March, which is what it's actually a British tune, but it was what was played when you were drummed out of the service, or to publicly shame you if you were a member of the army and did something worthy of punishment. So they started parading all of these price gouging merchants around the town. As they did, more and more militia members joined them. And they also ended up grabbing some of the generals from the Continental Army that were in the city at the time, including General Mifflin, for whom Fort Mifflin was named. And really significantly, while they were parading Mifflin around, I believe he spoke back to one of the militiamen at one point, and the man behind him struck him with the butt of his musket, which is not only showing willingness to strike a superior officer, but also a really distinct change from having to, like, doff your cap and get out of the way of every wealthy person in the city just 4 years ago. So there were attitudes had very quickly shifted in Philadelphia. And so eventually the militia brought all of the price gougers and the general and locked them up in the city gaol. They continued parading around, and one of the other officers, or one of the Continental Army officers, had gone around and warned everyone else that this is happening, we need to do something about it. And they had all holed up in the home of Fort James Wilson, who was a wealthy merchant. So they basically all ran into James Wilson's house, which was at 3rd and Chestnut Street, right on the corner there. It no longer exists. But the militia showed up out front. No one really knows who fired the first shot, but at some point, a gunfight erupted between the generals and merchants in the house and the militiamen outside. Then, as that fight was happening, I believe 4 militiamen stormed into the house, tried to knock down the front door, or actually did get inside, then got pushed back out. Then the militia rolled up a cannon in front of the house and prepared to open fire on it, at which point the city cavalry arrived and basically ran down the militia. Throughout the rest of the night, city cavalry and regular Continental Army troops, and mostly Continental Army cavalry, ran around the city, and there were small pitched skirmishes between them and the militia. But by the next day, most of the militia had been rounded up, were placed in the city jail. But the legislature or in the courts afterwards basically decided that it was in everyone's best interest to not press any charges against anyone involved in this and to just let everything pass. Then they also did distribute food and firewood to the working people of Philadelphia. But they recognized that if they imprisoned or executed anyone, they would immediately become a martyr, and they would have another revolution on their hands in a matter of days after that. And they also recognized that we have a lot of very hungry, very well-armed people in the city, and we should probably give them food. Otherwise, we will become the food. So the Siege of Fort Wilson, I wanted to include it because it represents a real radical shift in not only kind of the philosophical underpinnings of the American Revolution, but also in just the social order that existed at the time. It shows how everything could have gone very, very differently if just a few factors had been shifted. But if we want to move on to the next one, the Cordwainers. Sam, what's a Cordwainer?
A, rope makers, B, shoemakers, C, barrel makers, or D, harness makers.
Rope, Gabe.
Yep.
It's rope.
Yes, that's why they're making shoes. So Cordwainer is an oldie-timey term for shoemaker. I think comes from the French word for cordovan leather. So Philadelphia, in addition to being a merchant city, and one of the trades that really boomed in Philly was actually shoemaking. It was well set up with connection to both to Europe and to the Caribbean, and also had access to a lot of agrarian land for leather production. Now, shoemaking in the 19th century really shifted significantly, and has been kind of called one of the points of early examples of capitalism growing in Philadelphia. It used to be the shoemaking industry was set up on the old guild system, so you would have a master shoemaker who would train apprentices. The apprentices would then go on to become journeymen, who could then work for other masters. But what ended up happening is, this also meant that the master was usually working next to you or working with you in the shop, and all of the shoes you were making were custom fitted to every customer. For the most part, by the end of the 18th century, semi-standard shoe sizes started to exist, and that meant that a lot of the production you were doing was no longer custom for each customer, but was actually just mass produced off of a form. So while this wasn't an industrialized form of capitalism, because you were still doing all of this work by hand, it still really shifted the mode of production and made it so that you were just doing piecework and mass producing the same object over and over and over. Also market work, that mass produced work was generally called market work. That also allowed less skilled scab workers to come in and work at a lower wage. And we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to move a little bit quicker here. In order to combat that, the journeyman cordwainers formed the Federal Society of Journeyman Cordwainers of Philadelphia in 1794. They hadn't learned yet that you have to make everything sound like a good acronym. This was effectively the first real trade union in the United States, because this was after the Constitution was ratified. This initially set up as a system of mutual support, but they also would protest against scab labor. And then they actually engaged in one of the first strikes in 1798, striking against a reduction in their wages. They succeeded in 98, had another strike against reduced wages in 99. That one failed. And after the 99 strike, they basically remained peaceful for about 5 years, focusing mostly on mutual aid and trying to build up support within the trade itself. But over that time, there had been another shift in the shoe industry where market work started to get replaced by basically what were called slave shoes, which was an even cheaper shoe that was made specifically for export to the Caribbean sugar islands. One side effect of turning an entire island into a monoculture for basically profit exploitation is that there was not physically enough arable land left on the island to feed and clothe the workers that were there to work the sugar plantation. So Pennsylvania stepped in to provide butter, flour, and shoes, and also linen for clothing before the cotton industry came up. So initially the way export work was provided, or the way export work worked in the shops, was you could take that on as like an extra side duty. If you needed a little bit of extra cash, you could take another hour or so at the end of your workday and do some export work. What ended up happening over those 5 years between 1799 and 1804 is the masters started to almost solely offer export work. So you were no longer getting the custom-made shoes that paid well. You were now only being told, like, hey, make these poor quality shoes that I can sell at a high profit, but you don't get paid, or you barely get paid anything for. The journeyman struck in 1805, and the masters sued the journeymen. And on November 1st, a grand jury indicted the journeymen for illegal conspiracy to raise wages. This led to the court case of Commonwealth versus George Pullens. And this really pitted two visions of what early America would be against each other. So the prosecution was led by the Federalists, Jared Ingersoll and Joseph Hopkins. They basically argued that the Cordwainers, by demanding higher wages, had damaged not only their own industry, but society as a whole, and went back to English common law, stating that there was it was forbidden to conspire to raise wages, and that went against the free market. The defense was led by Democratic Republican lawyers Caesar Augustus Rodney and Walter Franklin. They argued that English common law no longer had any standing because they had just had a revolution to get rid of the English. So why are you still following the law from this country that we just expelled? Pennsylvania had no specific laws against combinations or unions. They also decried the accusation that Cordwainers were not part of society, instead arguing that labor constituted the real wealth of the country. And they argued that by joining together, that was their expressing their freedom as citizens of a new and democratic nation, and that by submitting to their masters' low wages, they were submitting to tyranny similar to that of King George. For time's sake, I highly suggest you go and read through the court transcript of Commonwealth v. Pullins, because
Or just listen to our episode about it.
that too. I should get better at advertising ourselves.
Business cards, guys.
So basically they were trying to lay out that the freedom afforded to citizens in the United States had to allow them to join together in combinations for mutual support to advance their own individual interests. Now, they laid out a very good case, but the judge was a Federalist and also quite wealthy, and basically just immediately sided with the prosecution. And in his speech to the jury, laid out the virtues of the free market, instructed them that the journeymen, by coming together into society to control wages, was against common law and an affront to said free market. So the jury found all 8 men guilty. All of them were fined $8. And the journeymen responded to that by creating a cooperative shoemaking warehouse where they would control everything. They purchased all of the materials themselves, tried to sell directly to the customer, but it seems like that ended up failing probably within the first couple of years. It's really difficult to set up a cooperative because you're going up against people who already have a strong financial backing, and the whole of financial society is going to back them rather than giving you a loan. But it did still represent kind of an early example of not only workers organizing together, but also a different vision for how American law could develop. Now, to finish up, we're going to go on to the general strike of 1835. So, Cordwainer Trial basically made union activity illegal, which put a damper on labor activism, both in Philly and around the country. But by the 1820s, you started to see a little bit more interest in kind of rebuilding the labor movement. So a group of both workers and organizers and radicals got together to form the Mechanics' Union of Trade Associations in 1827. This was a federation of craft unions, so it was a variety of different unions coming together to collaborate, work together, and fight for everyone's common interest. As part of this, they founded the Mechanics' Free Press, which was one of the first working class newspapers in the United States. That was led by a radical shoemaker named William Hayton, who left his job as a shoemaker and used what little savings he had to purchase a printing press. And basically, they set up this rogue newspaper. And that was specifically with the goal of educating all of the other workers and kind of raising general consciousness in the city. So Hayton was really focusing on educating everyone, but the rest of the Mechanics' Union wanted to get into politics. And so they started to shift their focus away from organizing or away from labor organizing and focused more on political organizing. Founding the Working Men's Party of Philadelphia in 1828, they tried to run a third-party ticket in the 1828 elections. Didn't really get anywhere, mostly because Philly was already controlled by 2 different political machines at that point. So they kind of collapsed in on themselves. Mechanics' Union started to fall in on themselves because there just wasn't any real organizational foundation to them. But the Mechanics Free Press had kind of started a spark, or it started to reignite some embers. And in 1833, veteran unionists, shoemakers, bookbinders, and tailors began work on building a new labor organization to kind of replace the MUTA, but with a focus on avoiding politics and just doing organizing plain and simple. So in 1834, they established the General Trades Union of the City and County of Philadelphia. The GTU set about spreading unionism throughout the city, and specifically were campaigning for a 10-hour day. So the way hours work generally at the time is, depending on the season, you just worked by daylight. So in the summer, that could mean a 16-hour day. In the winter, that could mean a 6-hour day. Which a 6-hour day sounds great, except that you're only getting 6 hours of pay, and everything's more expensive because it's winter. So they wanted to standardize that, have a flat 10-hour day around the year, and that meant working, I don't know how well you can see it, but 6 to 6, which meant you would start work at 6 a.m., work until, I believe, 11. You'd have 2 hours of basically a lunch break, and then you would work till 6 in the evening for a total of a 10-hour day. But so they started to spread that theory, started to organize around the city. Then in May of 1835, coal heavers on the Schuylkill, so these are people who barges of coal would come down the river. They would offload it by shovel into wheelbarrows, which would then be shipped across into the rest of the city. So coal heavers on the Schuylkill struck for the 10-hour day finally. They organized parades up and down the Schuylkill docks, and eventually on June 3rd led a march from the Schuylkill docks all the way to what we now call Independence Hall. At the time was City Hall. They were led by a drummer and a coal heaver carrying a sword. They had with a bunch of banners behind them, and basically they just marched through the city as a big parade. And as they as they were going through all the working class neighborhoods, people started to stream out and join them. Specifically, a lot of cordwainers, a lot of shoemakers, laid down all of their tools, declared we are all nothing, or we are all day laborers, and went to join this procession. So the march really just ballooned as it went through the city, and by the time it reached City Hall, had, from best guesses we've been able to figure out, maybe over 1,000 people, starting with probably 150 to 300. It was 300 coal heavers initially who had struck. But most importantly, there were people from every single trade in the city represented here. And this really marked a big change where prior to 1835, you had a lot of differentiation between skilled trades and unskilled trades. So coal heaving would be an unskilled trade because you didn't have to go through an apprenticeship to learn it. Skilled trade like carpentry, smithing, shoemaking, something like that, you did theoretically need to go through an apprenticeship to learn it. So the seeing carpenters and coal heavers striking along with each other was really a major shift in how the labor movement worked in the city. And the carpenters themselves actually set about organizing specifically for this strike because they knew it was coming. And they divided the city into regions and sent out organizers to get everyone ready at a drop of a hat to come and join what they knew was going to be a strike at some point. So the eventually, or by the end of 1835, or at the end of the summer of 1835, basically every trade had actually won their demand for a 10-hour day. Some trades delayed their agreement in negotiations with the bosses, but most importantly, coal heavers got the 10-hour day, and the masons and carpenters working on the Eastern State Penitentiary, which was under construction at the time, won the 10-hour day, which meant that Pennsylvania state workers got 10 hours. That also then led to all of the federal workers at the Navy Yard to get the 10-hour day, which then led the Secretary of the Navy to pass a circular stating that basically every Navy Yard would operate on a 10-hour day basis. So this one the 1835 strike in Philly basically created the 10-hour day as standard almost across the U.S. In basically a month, and really represented another philosophical shift in how the workers in the city viewed themselves as not just I'm a carpenter, I'm a cordwainer, I'm a silversmith, like the cordwainer said, I am a day laborer. They recognized that basically everyone who's working for a wage has some level of shared interest, and that they could all work together. I should also point out, while that all sounds great, there was still a very racist undercurrent throughout the whole of society in the city at the time, and there's no evidence that I have been able to find so far that either the mechanics union or the general trades union opened themselves up to black members. And general trades union was at least somewhat willing to organize women, although still in a fairly misogynistic way and paternalistic, that they were willing to organize female workers at some of the mills on the Schuylkill, but also constantly complained about women coming in and taking men's jobs. So the
Things haven't changed.
Yeah, conditional support to the general trades union. But now that I'm out of breath, thank you. That was a very brief synopsis of 4 topics that I encourage everyone to look much, much more deeper into. But a general overview of some of the early radical philosophy that underpinned Philly's labor movement. And we also have some time for questions if we can. I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Questions?
We can, if you want to speak up so we can catch you on
It'll
the mic.
catch you, don't worry.
Yeah.
So is there a historical reasoning that could explain why we moved away from 10-hour shifts to 8-hour shifts in modern times?
Yes. So the 8-hour day movement started in the 1860s with the International Working Man's Association, which was a international group of labor unions, radicals. It was actually the general secretary when they made that decision was Karl Marx, if I remember correctly. So they passed a resolution that would be their new campaign. Ended up not really going anywhere until 1886 when you had the Haymarket strike, or when you had the strike in Chicago, which led to the Haymarket riot. Again, that didn't lead to the 8-hour day being established, but it became a rallying cry. Then in the 1930s, you had anarchists, socialists, and communists all actually campaigning for the 4-hour day in order basically to split a workday, so you'd have a morning shift and an afternoon shift as a way to get full employment. And as a compromise position, they passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, in 1937, if I remember correctly. And that legally established an 8-hour day and a 40-hour work week as a standard. So anything beyond a 40-hour work week would be overtime by federal law. But a lot of this, basically, each campaign for a shorter workday was a convenient tool as a rallying cry for unions to say, like, hey, this is a specific win that you can get if you fight for it. And so there have been like the 8-hour day movement lasted really for about 60 years. And then the 4-hour day movement was really about a decade in the 20s and 30s. But there's lots of really great posters for the 4-hour day that I always like bringing up. But thank you.
Other questions?
So you mentioned that there were some women who were allowed into the labor union. What were some of the jobs they held at the time?
So most of them were working in the spinning mills on the Schuylkill. So they'd be weavers. They'd tend, not spinning looms. There's a specific name, spinning frames, if I'm not mistaken. So making spinning either cotton, flax, or wool into yarns, and then spinning yarn into thread. And that was one of the first industries that really saw a large introduction of women workers, because it was basically viewed as not needing a lot of physical strength. And there was also already a domestic production of yarn and threads that was viewed as women's work. Then weirdly, once like it was women's work to, well, weaving was still men's work because that was considered a skilled trade. It gets really complicated. And then once everything industrializes, a lot of those concepts went out the window. And it was also whenever basically the bosses wouldn't bring in women or minority workers unless they were able to use them to undercut the wages of the white men so that they can then divide and conquer against each other, which keeps on happening.
The playbook has not changed.
It really,
And neither has ours. We'll keep on fighting.
Yep.
exactly.
We have time for one more brief question.
You talked about the Germantown petition, but did any of the subsequent movements that were more labor driven take any positions on slavery?
From what I can tell, the Cordwainers didn't. They were ostensibly opposed to being forced to create shoes for the export market to the slave islands in the Caribbean, but that wasn't necessarily solidarity with the enslaved. That was, this hurts our wages. Then both the Mechanics Union of Trade Associations and the General Trades Union, at least from what I've been able to tell, never really got to the point of even recognizing that the existence of slavery was a threat to their wages. I think it was probably a lot of them not wanting to upset the apple cart too much, and they recognized that their way of life was still built on this system, so they didn't want to threaten. They just wanted higher wages. They didn't want to totally upset the society that they still had some privileges in. I believe it was 1838 that the one of the first buildings built by the Abolition Society in Pennsylvania got burnt down the year or the day after it was built. So,
Yeah, Pennsylvania Hall. So
Yeah.
WHYY is now.
Yep. So, like I said, very conditional support to every single one of these groups.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All righty.
Yeah, thank you. Giving me something to do on a Monday afternoon.